The Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, has suggested that he could impose a public sector pay freeze in his spending review, which he's due to unveil on Wednesday. NHS frontline workers are likely to be excluded. Labour said the move would be a kick in the teeth for the people the country have relied on in recent months. And Mr Sunak also suggested that he wouldn't introduce tax rises in the near future, despite the government borrowing what he said was an enormous sum to cope with the pandemic. Well, joining me is Alfie Stirling, who's the chief economist at New Economics Foundation. Sorry, Alfie. Good afternoon or good evening, as you prefer.
Good evening. Thanks for having me on.
Really appreciate it. On a day when the news has come that the government has borrowed some £70 billion over the course of this pandemic, 70 billion. How much more can it afford when it comes to the spending review, do you think?
Well, actually, we're not at the moment experiencing any constraint on the amount of borrowing the government can engage with at the moment. I mean, in many ways, the public finances are a lot like radiators. So, in winter, the radiators come on automatically to keep the house warm. And it's much like that in a recession. And we all know that as the economy starts to grow again, coming out of that recession, the ratio of that public debt to the size of the economy will start to shrink again and become more sustainable. So it's very important that we don't get too worried, too hysterical about the level of government borrowing right now, because actually, if government isn't protecting incomes in the middle of a recession, what that will mean is more jobs are lost, spending in the economy goes down, tax receipts in the future also go down, and not only do the public finances become weaker in the long term, but we're also going to see long-term unemployment and a weaker and poorer economy overall as well.
Alfie, you're so polite not to correct me, by the way, and thank you for that comparison of the economy being like central heating. I think everybody got that, and it makes sense. As soon as you said it, it made sense. But you didn't correct me on the fact that I got this thing wrong. Very kind of you, because the 70 billion that I referred to is the deficit in terms of tax revenue that the government has had. It's 70 billion pounds less tax revenue over the course of this pandemic than it would normally have. Now, wherever, however you want to call that, whether it's, public spending or tax revenue, or whether it's borrowing or wherever it comes from, it is still a loss to the government here. And it will have that in mind when the Chancellor decides on his spending review. That will be amongst the uppermost things in his mind, that we have got a lot less money than even on a normal winter when we switch on the central heating, I'd have thought.
Well, that's right. I mean, so it's 70 billion lower taxes than expected. Actually, the overall borrowing for this year, this financial year, is expected to rise to about 400 billion overall. At the moment, it's a little bit over 200 billion. But this is the really key point, which is that right now, the types of organisations that governments borrow from, so that's pension funds, insurance companies, other sovereign wealth funds from other countries, that are all looking for a long-term investment. At the moment, they're all falling over each other to be able to lend to government. And that's because when there's so much weakness in the economy, they can't get a return anywhere else. You don't want to be investing in companies right now that are vulnerable. You'd much prefer to put your money with government. And what that means is interest rates at the moment are actually negative after you account for inflation. So investors are paying government to borrow from them. It's quite a hard concept to get your head around, but that is the truth right now. Government makes money by borrowing, and that's before you take account of all the things I was talking about before in terms of protecting incomes to keep the economy strong. So I think it is really important that we don't make the mistake of 10 years ago and thinking that government is in any way comparable to a family or a business. It's a very, very different entity. It's got institutions throughout the economy. It's got record low borrowing costs, and it's got a responsibility to maintain people's livelihoods during a downturn.
And that is a very important role of government. Of course it is. You would have thought, though, the reason why the government is always a safe place to invest in, well, our government, not all governments, is because that they are, they're going to keep their credit rating up. They don't want to have bad credit rating whatsoever. And whilst they've got good credit rating, safe place to expect a return at some point. How long can they push back the inevitable? They're going to have to pay back this borrowing at some point. The Chancellor says that he's not going to increase taxing anytime in the near future, which might be the time to increase taxes, although that will have a knock-on effect on the economy as well, won't it? For how long can they push back the inevitable, which is the point where they have to pay back all of this borrowing?
I mean, I think tax rises in general are a good idea because at some point we will need stronger, permanent public services. Going into this pandemic, we had very weak public services as a result of 10 years of underinvestment, and that has shown. So I think tax rises, for the right reasons, will be important. But if we don't need tax rises right now, as you say, or as the chancellor in fact has conceded, to paying back this debt. And in terms of your question, for how long can this go on for? It's all about monitoring the macroeconomy. So the interesting thing about the UK is we've got our own currency and we've got an independent central bank. So if at any point, private sector investors are kind of reticent to lend to our government, then the central bank, the Bank of England, they're always a lender of last resort. And so that's why it's not so much actually about whether the finance markets have confidence. It's about really looking at those economic fundamentals. Now, at some point, when inflation starts to rise, it's at the moment it's about half of what the target should be. It's 1% rather than 2%. But as inflation starts to rise, as people get back into work, then we know that actually further government borrowing, will end up being harmful for the economy. And at that point, government should slowly ease back. It should push for lower borrowing, perhaps some tax rises at that point, but also making sure the economy is producing prosperity for people. And at that point, interest rates will start to rise as well. But we're so far off that right now. We're in the middle of the worst recession since World War II. At the moment, we're just not in danger of overheating the economy.
How does the government want us to play this then? Because not increasing tax is always seen as a kind of a boost for the economy, or to try and get the economy back up and running. Because if you don't increase tax, then there's more money to play around with within the economy. How does the government want us to act? And also look at that. If the government is borrowing so cheaply, why won't the chancellor then increase, or why does he want to freeze public spending next year, or public sector salaries next year, when actually he can afford then, can't he, to increase it for not just NHS workers but for everybody in the public sector?
He can, and unfortunately, I think the idea of cutting or freezing public sector pay increases is really bad policy. It's not just bad from a moral point of view. We've really come to realise in this pandemic just how undervalued many of our key workers are, and many of them are in the public sector. And actually, I think morally, it's right that we try and restore their job security, restore their pay to where it should be. And many of them have suffered a pay cut, in fact, in real terms for the last 10 years. But even economically, it's a real false economy to be cutting back or freezing public sector pay. So on the one hand, you've got problems with job retention or weaker public services. If you hold back pay, you'll end up paying more in the long term through private consultants, as we've seen too many times during this pandemic. But also, people often try and draw a comparison between public and private, and saying, well, private sector's taken some job losses, shouldn't the public sector take a hit in pay as well? But that is an entire false economy as well, because private sector jobs rely on spending in the economy. It needs, it needs me to spend our pay packets to create those jobs in the private sector. And so if you hold back public sector pay increases, you're going to cost private sector jobs as well. So I think it would be a bad policy if the chancellor were to pursue it.
That's the headline ahead of this spending review on Wednesday. Are there any other things you expect the Chancellor to do or to announce on Wednesday?
So we've already got some, dripping out of announcements. We know that defence spending is going to rise rapidly, which, if to be honest, that sort of puts into stark relief a much cheaper increase along with inflation of public sector pay. Why are some departments getting it and not others? But I think the big story is likely to be an increase in capital investment. So going back to those ultra low borrowing costs we talked about earlier, I think the Chancellor has recognised the opportunity there, and that now is a really good time to borrow, not just to pay for the public services we need in this pandemic, but also to be opportunistic and say, okay, let's get investment into our our railways, our wind turbines, home insulation. Let's make those investments now while it's cheap. And so I expect we will see some of that at the spending review as well.
So big infrastructure projects is what you're saying, really, that the government should be doing now and pushing money into, yeah?
Well, I think it's big infrastructure project which politicians love, but it's also lots of small infrastructure projects as well. So, for example, if we were to go out and insulate every single residential home that was currently, low-hanging fruit for insulation, that would create jobs. It would save energy bills for those residents, but also be really good for our energy consumption and our carbon emissions. So it's win-win-win, and that isn't so much a big, grand, bridge or high-speed rail project, but it is just multiple thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of homes being insulated to make our economy more efficient.
What will the impact? So, because also uppermost, I would have thought in the Chancellor's minds are jobs. We know that October and no doubt November have seen real sharp increases in unemployment. How tricky is it for him to, on the one hand, sort of try and boost up the economy and have some good news there, but also to get jobs back? How does he do that? What's available? What options are available to him?
I mean, I think there are three levers you need to pull. One is job protection, direct job protection. For example, the furlough scheme, and there I think we finally got there with the job protection scheme being extended. But as you pointed out, the delays during October have cost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of jobs already. The second lever then I think is about maintaining pay. So public sector pay is part of that, but actually it's other policies like minimum wage policy, but also social security, so universal credit, making sure that those people who do drop out of the labour market for a bit still have an income, because not only is that good for them, but it means they are able to spend. It will protect other people's jobs as well. And then I think the third one is about job creation, where government has a really important role directly in creating jobs of the future. And I think there we need to be thinking about what is the long-term shape of our economy. And I think it is more green jobs in green infrastructure, green renewable energy, but also more caring jobs as well. We found, we have an underfunded social care service, we have underfunded NHS and underfunded childcare as well, which has been another big problem, probably underreported problem in this pandemic. And expanding those workforces for the future, I think will be vital for recovery from this pandemic.
Can we come back stronger, do you think, from the pandemic economically? Is it possible?
I think it absolutely is possible, not least because in the end, the best way to measure an economy is not in numbers or GDP. It's what does it do for society? How does it best serve the people that work and live in it? And in that respect, we can certainly make big improvements. We went into that pandemic with really high levels of inequality, very low pay growth, insecurity at work, mental health issues. Things were not rosy before the pandemic. And actually, with the right political will, with the right choices about what things we value, for example, spending more money on being able to care for people in old age, for example, we'll end up with a much stronger economy insofar as it's doing better things for society. It's delivering for society much better.